let's talk about now. Well, we're going to talk to Mark Francois, who's Shadow Defence Minister, in part about the Chagos Islands, but also about a petition calling on the government not to make changes to legislation that would allow Northern Ireland veterans to be prosecuted for doing their duty in combating terrorism as part of Operation Banner. Mark, great to have you on the programme. Explain to me about this petition and the legislation that could actually see some of our ex-forces facing the law.
Right. So the petition, which has been going for just under a week and now has over 60,000 signatures, and I'm very much hoping that after this interview some of your listeners might add to that, was created by a number of Army veterans. And it says basically that the government should not allow any changes to legislation which would allow Army veterans to be prosecuted for fighting terrorism in Northern Ireland on what was known at the time as Operation Banner. The context is the government are saying they want to take out parts of the 2023 Legacy Act, which we introduced while we were in government. It would have two effects. One, it would mean that they could start this whole cycle again of endless investigation and re-investigation of veterans, many of whom were investigated and cleared of any wrongdoing at the time. And secondly, it would allow Gerry Adams to sue the British taxpayer. So we think this is beyond bonkers, but that is what the Labour government are proposing to do. The veterans are furious, and so we're trying to get 100,000 signatures on the petition so we can have a debate in Parliament and hopefully persuade the government to drop this very bad idea.
What is the motivation for them to do this, though? Why do they want to do this? It doesn't seem to be in the national interest.
It isn't. But the answer to your very good question is, look, this is a government dominated by human rights lawyers. The Prime Minister is a human rights lawyer. The Attorney General is a human rights lawyer. And some courts in Northern Ireland ruled that some elements of the Legacy Act were incompatible with the Human Rights Act, which goes back to the European Convention on Human Rights. The government could have appealed to higher courts against those rulings, but chose not to because they wanted to uphold the Human Rights Act. So this is all coming about because we have a Labour government obsessed, I use the word deliberately, with human rights, even to the point of throwing Army veterans to the wolves.
I know that there are a lot of ex-servicemen who are deeply worried about this, and also setting a precedent in future for, you know, the theatre of war is an ugly place. Decisions have to be made in a split second. And this idea that now when we're sending men over to fight to defend our nation, to protect us from tyranny and protect us from terrorism, that they may have to be questioning what they're doing every single moment, which I think would be a huge burden.
Well, of course, and in fact, Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Justice Secretary, has put out a brilliant video this morning that absolutely summarises that point. And he includes in it a letter from a former commander of the SAS, now a retired brigadier, who explains this in detail. And there's a wonderful quote in there when he says, "Why would you soldier for a government that will abandon you?" And many veterans and serving soldiers now feel that this government hasn't got their back. And as you say, why would you rationally want to join the army if you had to go and fight, which is what ultimately soldiers are trained to do, and then 40 or 50 years later, you know, in the autumn of your life, find yourself dragged into a courtroom to be prosecuted for obeying orders in the first place, you know? So this isn't just about protecting veterans, although that's critically important. They were there to uphold the rule of law in Northern Ireland in the first place against the terrorists. But it's also about providing a situation where people feel confident to join the army today, knowing they're not going to be, you know, pulled in front of a court and a bunch of human rights lawyers half a century later. And in that scenario, what sensible person would sign up?
Right, exactly. You don't want people in the battlefield suddenly thinking, oh, if I do something, I might get in trouble for it down the line. Let's talk now. We're talking about getting in trouble for something down the line. It seems that's the measured strategy that the Labour Party are deploying when it comes to the Chagos Islands deal, because apparently they're now delaying plans to hand over the Chagos Island to Mauritius because they're worried about the political cost of it. They're worried about an almighty backlash. I mean, perhaps that indicates they shouldn't be doing it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, yes. Well, look, we have been, I mean, I can tell your viewers and listeners in all sincerity, we have been arguing against this from the moment we heard that they might be seriously contemplating it. How does it make sense at a time when the government have taken very controversial decisions to restrict winter fuel payments to up to 10 million pensioners, now to take away some PIP payments from disabled people, to at the same time give away up to £18 billion of British taxpayers' hard-earned money to Mauritius in order to rent back a strategic island that belongs to us in the first place. And someone in number 10 miraculously seems to have woken up to the fact that this isn't very popular. And I think the reason that they're sitting on it is they can't persuade their MPs to vote for it, rightfully, because it's plainly bonkers.
Let's talk now about the comments of relatively new Chancellor in Germany, Friedrich Merz, who has basically said that Germany needs to have a bigger and better army than Britain. I mean, it would be great to see Germany finally sort of crawling out of their guilt-ridden ineptitude when it comes to actually standing up for European interests and being part of the fight to defend Europe against our enemies. But I don't really understand why he needs it to be bigger than the UK. What's your take on this?
Well, you know, Germany are an ally in NATO, and NATO has helped to keep the peace since the end of the Second World War. And there's been this big debate about we should all spend in NATO more money, and I think that we should. So, you know, if the Germans are going to increase their defence spending materially, which, given the war in Ukraine, they say they now are going to do, I welcome that. You know, we're going to increase our defence spending as well because, perhaps I could give your constituents, your listeners some flavour. I was in Poland a week ago, and in Poland, obviously they're much nearer to the problem. The official policy of the Polish government is now to have a massive rearmament programme in order to prepare to fight a war, if necessary, they'd rather deter it, with Russia within 3 years.
Wow.
So the Poles, and this is the policy of the government.
Yeah.
The Poles are now spending nearly 5% of GDP on defence. We're pledged to spend half that. And they've got 4 armoured divisions, they're growing a 5th, and now they want a 6th one. So all of us in NATO need to increase our spending because history shows the best way to prevent war is to deter it by persuading a potential aggressor, in this case, obviously, Vladimir Putin, a former KGB colonel, by the way, that he couldn't win because we're prepared and have the kit and the training to fight him. And that comes back to where we came in, which is you need trained soldiers to do that, and you're not going to have enough of those if they think they get sued for fighting a war.
Do you know, I think you make extremely important points there, Mark. We live in perilous times, but I wouldn't put much trust in this government to make sure that we're equipped and prepared to deal with them.